Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to this video series, Introduction to Firewalls. Deploying a web server with a SQL backend. Many websites collect information for registrations, newsletter, or purchasing information. Typically, this information is stored in a database. Figure 12.5 shows a typical DMZ configuration for a web server with a back-end Oracle database located on the private network. In Figure 12.5, the web server is located in the DMZ at IP address 192.168.223.13, must access an Oracle SQL backend server using SQL star net net connection. The Oracle server is located in the private network at IP address 192.168.222.5. To access the web server, the server must allow both hypertext transfer protocol and secure SSL HTTPS to access the web server. In addition, the firewall must allow the web server to communicate with the Oracle server using the SQL star net connection. This requires connections to the Oracle server listening on TCP port 1521. The first step is to define the static address mapping that will redirect HTTP and HTTPS packets received at the firewall to the web server in the DMZ. Table 12.9 shows the static address mappings that must be deployed at the firewall in order to allow HTTP and HTTPS redirects to the web server. So 23.16.16.5 TCP 80 192.168.223.13 80 23.16.16.5 TCP 443 192.168.223.13 443. After the static address mappings are defined, the external firewall rules must be configured. Table 12.10 shows the firewall rules that must be implemented in order to allow connections to the web server. So HTTP, TCP, any 192.168.223.13 80 allow. HTTPS, TCP, any 192.168.223.13 443 allow. The last step is to configure the internal firewall to allow the web server to connect to the Oracle backend database in the private network. Table 12.11 shows the firewall rule that must be configured at the internal firewall. Protocol, transport protocol, source IP, source port, target IP, target port, action. Oracle SQL net TCP 192.168.223.13 any 192.168.222.5 1521 allows SQL star net, allowing private network users to access the internet. In many ways, the more difficult configurations with a firewall DMZ involve outbound traffic rather than inbound traffic. This is because the original source address information is typically translated at either the internal or external firewall. Figure 12.6 shows a typical configuration in which internal clients on the 192.168.222.0/24 network will be allowed to access the internet, though the two firewalls between the private network and the internet. In this scenario, the best strategy is to configure the firewalls starting at the innermost firewall and work your way out to the firewall between the DMZ and the internet. If you assume that the DMZ and if you assume that the DMZ in figure 12.6 uses 192.168.223.0/24 private network addressing, the internal firewall requires the firewall rule shown in table 12.12 to allow outbound network traffic to the internet from the private network. So protocol, transport protocol, source IP, source port, target IP, target port, action, any 192.168.222.0/24, any allow. Because both the private network and the DMZ use private network address translation, the packets have the same source IP and port information when they reach the external firewall, but before the packets are transmitted on the internet. To allow this traffic, the external firewall must be configured with the same outbound firewall rules as the internal rule shown in table 12.12. The only catch is that the external firewall must be configured to perform network address translation on the outbound packets. All outbound packets that arrive at the external firewall that originated from either the private network or the DMZ must be translated to the external browsing address configured at the firewall. Table 12.3 shows the network address translation that must be performed at the external firewall. So source IP, source port, translated IP, translated port, action 192.168.222.0/24, any 23.16.16.5, any allow. 192.168.223.0/24, any 23.16.16.5, any allow. The scenario changes if the DMZ is configured to use public network addressing. When public network addressing is used in the DMZ, the internal firewall, not the external firewall, must be configured to perform network address translation, assuming that the internal firewall's network interface connected to the DMZ uses the IP address 23.16.18.5. The translation must be configured at the internal firewall as shown in table 12.14 so that the outbound packets have public network addresses after they enter the DMZ. So 192.168.222.0/24, any 23.16.18.5, any allow. The internal firewall must be configured to allow the original source address to pass into the DMZ. You use the true IP address as shown in table 12.5 rather than the translated address, because the firewall rules are applied at one firewall while the NAT takes place at the other firewall. So any 192.168.222.0/24, any allow. The external firewall requires different address information in its outbound firewall rules because the original source address information has now been translated to the common IP address of 23.16.18.5. Table 12.16 shows the outbound firewall rule required to allow private network users to access the internet. So any 23.16.18.5, any allow. So I'm going to leave it here this evening for this video. If you like listening, please consider like, sharing and subscribing. Thank you.